All right, here we go. So, welcome to another episode of our show, and I'm super excited today. I actually just watched today another episode of Falcon and Winter Soldier. Have you seen this yet, Bruce?
Not yet. I'm hearing good things, but I haven't gotten around to watching the first. I think it's what's a couple episodes out.
I think it's two. Yeah, two so
Yeah,
far. Yeah, as of this recording, it's two, and
yeah,
it feels much more Marvel-y than WandaVision. I didn't love it. Like it was good, but like I enjoyed it. I watched it, but I don't know. It just felt like a chore to me. I
yeah.
didn't
My
get.
brother, who's like a huge Marvel nut fanatic, even he couldn't full heartedly recommend
Yeah.
WandaVision.
I feel bad saying it that I couldn't. I don't know why, but I was like, yeah. I just at the end of the day, like, it felt like a chore. But Falcon and Winter Soldier feels like you're home. You're like, okay, these are the guys. They have their own shit. Like, the writing feels very much aligned. So I'm like, I feel like we're like Falcon and Winter Soldier in a way. Two guys bantering, and then we have kind of one of the biggest divisive conflicts in our history, at least today, that we're going to debate about, which is
Yeah,
Paul and John. Who do you like better, Paul McCartney or John Lennon of the Beatles? Right? This is a hard one,
yeah. This is huge, right? And this is a debate that goes back since the early days of Beatlemania, really.
right?
And then you have kind of revisionists, and you had so many twists and turns in the story, and you had each one kind of going in and out of favor in different ways. So this will be quite the bit to take a bite out of.
But can I be honest? Here's what I think. No, lie to me. Yes, I'm gonna be honest. Here, I'm gonna be real with you. I'm gonna say this is also an age-old question, that goes deeper, which is that, like, to me, it's like, so I'm a DC fan. I love DC comics. I have a Superman tattoo, and I used to have a best friend who uh, uh, loved Batman. He couldn't stand that I love Superman. He was like, what? It's so cheesy. Like, why would you be into this perfect, like, Boy Scout? And it's that same thing now of, like, I think in a lot of divisiveness, it's like, do you like the gritty and dark and kind of meta, or do you like the more optimistic? So I personally liked the first Captain America movie, not like the one from the '80s, but like the like the Chris Evans one. I liked it.
Yeah.
I remember this friend. We were still friends at that time, and he's like, "See, that's the shit." He's like, "This is why you like that Superman shit." And I was like, "Oh my god, why?" Because I like it's not even saccharine. I like positive endings. I like when the hero like jumps the occasion. And so to me, that is actually at the core. Would you agree? That's the core of Paul versus John. Paul Superman, John Batman.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it, actually. I would agree with that. Yeah, because you have obviously, Paul, at least on the surface, even though I do agree with McCartney, he's kind of made his defense about this, how really when you go beneath the surface, they were both actually very similar in terms of their taste and, where they came from. But as far as how it manifested, it did manifest quite differently. And Paul has a naturally more sunny, outgoing, accessible personality.
Yeah.
Whereas with John, it was always a little bit, even the girls kind of found him a little bit intimidating and all that stuff. So it was always kind of had a little bit of that edge, which obviously appeals to another sector of fans. So I guess that's kind of what made them the perfect storm, the perfect recipe. Because if you had the four together, it's kind of like the perfect person, the combination of the four elements that you'd want. So
And that being said, let's kind of start. Let's go backwards. Um, Post Beatles, post breakup. Do what's your take on where they ended up? Like do you like when we're saying Paul or John, we're specifically talking between like what, like 58, 59 to 70 or so. When
yeah,
when's the official break? When's like Abbey Road? 70,
Abbey Road
79.
was released in '69, but really like the official breakup happened in '70. So yeah, basically by the end of the decade they were done. So
Yeah.
we're really roughly looking at like if we're looking like the recorded output, probably looking from like '62 to '70 around that time frame.
Yeah. And then cuz like when they were out on their own, did does it, like, is it fair comparing when they're out, like after 70, like Wings or Plastic Ono Band, like is it fair, is it a fair comparison at that point? I don't know.
I think the only thing interesting about the comparison is that you can, with their solo stuff, much more easily tell what each brought
Yeah.
to the table. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, because then
Yeah.
you can kind of trace it back and see where they strengthen each other, where there some of the holes in the game were. That I think becomes more apparent in the 70s, even though there was a lot of good stuff released by both then too, I think.
Yeah. Um, I love, like, I will say, like, I'm Paul I'll tell you, in the debate, I'm a Paul McCartney guy. But I like Working Class Hero is one of my favorite songs. Like,
Yeah.
hands down. I would say, I don't talk about it enough, but like, it is one of my favorite, like, in top 10 favorite songs, Working Class Hero. I don't know why. I've always been, since the first time I heard it when I was a teenager, I used it in a play I was directing. And my high school theater teacher, one of them, he's like, Who is this Bob Dylan ripoff?" And I'm like, John Lennon. And this guy was this. He was the tech director. He was a big guy, like huge guy, just such a jerk. And I remember this is the only time in my entire life I'd ever seen his face just drop, and he could see what an asshole he was, and he goes, "Oh, okay." And he fully goes, "Oh, okay. Well, that's okay
Yeah, yeah.
then." He like
Totally walked it back. Yeah.
totally walked it back. He's like fucking Bob Dylan wannabe. Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Um,
Go ahead.
yeah. So like, where are you in the debate? Like, let's go there. Like, where, like, Paul, John, who do you fancy?
Yeah, it's. I think I mentioned this to you last week. Anytime people ask me, I always say that John is the Beatle I'm more like, but Paul was the Beatle that I wanted to be,
Yeah,
right? So I think I always gravitated towards Paul's musicality much more than John's, but I have a lot of love for John too. So I think I'll be able to kind of take up his side in
in the
as we're kind of
debate.
talking the finer points of this for sure.
All right, so let's take it back. Let's take it back to the top. Um, so you're right. Like, similar backgrounds. They grow up the same place. They become friends. But they were like friends of a friend, right? I don't remember that sort. Like,
Yeah, I think Ivan Vaughn was the one, kind of a schoolmate that introduced them both to each other at a kind of village fete, which would be like an outdoor kind of garden party, or like like what would be like the equivalent of like a little neighborhood festival, and
yeah,
John was playing with the early version of the Quarrymen, and Paul gets introduced to him backstage. A famous story goes, and he happened to have his guitar, or borrowed a guitar from one of the guys, played it upside down, had that skill already, was able to do that, and I think he played 20 Flight Rock for John, knew the words, which John was impressed with, and yeah, I think John said he had to kind of make the call then, is like, do I pull this guy in and make the band stronger, or do I keep myself as the star? Which, I thought was very telling, because it was like, at a young age like that, to make the decision to say, you know what, for sake of the ego, make the group stronger. I was
yeah.
like, hey, kudos to John for that, and recognizing that, hey, this guy could bring a lot to the table, and take us elsewhere. So
But I remember hearing stories about this too. That when he first met Paul too, he was like, "That's the musician,"
yeah,
right? He was
yeah,
like,
because Paul knew more chords. He had a little
yeah,
more facility on the instrument. I know John was taught by his mother Julia before she passed. Like just basic banjo chords, things like that. Different kind of fingerings and stuff. So I know when the early days when they got together, Paul was, I think, teaching him some proper technique on the guitar. But I think John recognized that right away. Paul's musicality, sprang forth.
yeah. And then what influence did they have on each other? Like, you're much more versed in this than I. Like, I, how much did John let Paul influence him on his end when he was writing? Because they didn't write together, right? I know the publishing is that they both had to say Lennon McCartney, but like they both were pretty separate in the writing side, right?
In the early days, they wrote much more together.
Hmm.
It's really like, I think when you start getting into, maybe around,
Help?
yeah, around there, you can see more of their individual styles kind of
Yeah.
coming out a little bit. And I think they were still working together, but by the time you get to the White Album, they're really
Oh
writing
yeah.
individually. But for a long stretch, especially those early songs, like they said, they wrote like maybe 100 tunes before any good ones came out. So they had a backlog of songs, but they would write together. They would meet up, I think, in front room of Paul's house or whatever, and just get together and have writing sessions then. So they were writing together at that point. And I'm sure, even though John was outwardly a rocker, I
Yeah.
think the fact that John also did like sort of the more ballady stuff, and I think Paul facilitated that and made it okay for
Yeah.
John to write stuff like that down the line also. It didn't have to be all kind of straight rock and roll.
Cause those like as you're saying that, I'm thinking like those like Julia, um, like even I mean, there's so many like
In
I
My
can't
Life,
in my life. Thank you. Yeah, I know that's a John song, right? Like
yeah.
that's not to me. That's I forget that that's a John song. Hide Your Love Away. Like to me, those are like John playing Paul songs. Is that blasphemous? What I just said?
To some out there, they'd probably be like, well, kill this guy.
I
Um,
apologize. I apologize if that's offensive. That was just
Warning at the
wasn't even a
stage.
question.
No, but you know what? I mean, I think it's a fair thing, especially within my life, because I always heard In My Life as like John's answer to Yesterday, right? Like Paul comes in
Right.
with Yesterday, kind of does it on his own. It's like, and it's like the quintessential, ballad. And I always felt like In My Life was his answer to that in a way, and to show
Yeah.
that he could write with that kind of, kind of depth and all of that too.
Whereas, wait, Norwegian Wood, like who wrote Norwegian Wood?
John wrote Norwegian Wood, although I think it was Paul's suggestion at the end to close the narrative with the guy burning down the girl's house. Surprisingly, coming from Paul. But yeah,
Right, but musically to me, Norwegian Wood sounds like a Paul song, you know.
okay,
But like it's not, like it's so not because it's so weird.
yeah, yeah. So that could, again, that kind of makes the argument of how they each rubbed off on each other. I think
Right,
it brought out more melody in John's songwriting.
right,
And I think flip side, if you look at it, obviously John toughened up, Paul's maybe candy gas tendencies a little bit, where Paul can
There's
go
the
a little
proof.
soft, which we would learn, later on, like, with some of the Wing stuff, if left to his own devices, it could be a little bit too soft, and so kind of, yeah, John there to be the ideal editor and, maybe make other suggestions.
Live and Let Die, my friend. That
Oh
song is.
yeah, no, I mean that's like I said, there was great stuff then, but there's some other tracks that we could point to that'd be like, okay, that would use another draft of that, Paul. Come on,
Band on the Run. Uh,
I love that track. I think that's actually that one and Live and Let Die. I think those, and maybe I'm amazed are like kind of high points, because I
oh,
feel like Band on the Run picked up where his work on Abbey Road left off in terms of the kind of almost the symphonic structure of it, and
yeah.
the kind of piecing together different song fragments and ideas. So, but we'll get to that later.
I was making fun of it like lyrically, but like I don't know, I just never found it like lyrically that interesting. Like you're right,
Yeah.
musically it's great, but like that whole era. Like, did you ever see what's that movie? There's a movie where it's like I think it's like the late '70s, starring Paul McCartney, and he plays Paul McCartney, and it's like I forget what it's called now, but it's like a day in his life or like he's like recording and it's kind of like
Does it give my regards to Broad Street?
yes.
That was 84.
That was 84. Oh, okay,
Yeah.
wow. But he plays like I like you think that people wanna hit the love of silly love songs, you know?
Yeah.
Like that song to me is like the epitome of like the pure saccharine.
Right.
But that whole movie feels very like, oh shucks, it feels like Mickey Mouse, like
Very, very showbiz side of who he
yeah.
is. Yeah. Yeah.
And he's in a car and there's like email in the car, like in 1984 style, or like, yeah. So at any rate, that's an example. So I agree with you on that one, like as an example of his like cheesiness. But with yeah, what are some examples like? What are some examples of some of the tougher? To your point, what are the like tougher Paul songs? Definitely in the White Album, but like what like prior to that, let's say.
Uh, whenever he's doing his take on Little Richard, like She's a Woman, doing something like She's a Woman, it's kind of has that grit to it, in the
Yeah,
singing. Um, trying to think, Drive My Car has a little bit of that sass, a little bit of that in the vocal. So, his lead vocals on Sergeant Pepper, that's pure rock for
yeah,
sure, you know. So yeah, I mean, even pointing prior to stuff like Helter Skelter, which is the ultimate, kind of hard,
exactly.
heavy thing. Um, those would be kind of examples of like, why don't we do it in the road, that kind of stuff, which you said, kind of White Album stuff.
Right, and then yeah, like totally like Abbey Road. By the time it's Abbey Road, like so much of it is like pure throaty, like hard rock,
Yeah, for
right?
sure, for sure. I think
As
that kind of
opposed to
was his peak as a singer. You get to Abbey Road and he's just like consummate in terms of being able to do ballads, rockers, anything in between.
yeah. And so that's one of my major arguments is that, if you look at like to me, he's so much more versatile because to me, John is pretending. Like, and that's gonna, I mean, if we're getting a lot of listeners, I'm
Hate
sorry.
mail for Ron over the next couple
I,
months.
right? Like like to me, he's trying to find, like, I know he's troubled. I know he's a troubled individual. I know he comes from a lot of pain. But I think he was just, in many ways, I mean, definitely a musical genius, but I think he was like searching, like yearning, like striving to be something so intense. And when he found Yoko, like she is that, like she was that, like she just,
Yeah.
I generally don't think she gave a fuck about what people thought of her.
Right.
I think she was so invested in her artistic creation and in like her world and stuff. Whereas I think that was so enticing for him. I think musically he's looking for that, like the whole
Yeah.
time.
I mean, you could make the larger argument that he was always, you know, call it spiritually or psychically, was always in search of something, right?
Right, in
In search
search.
of, you know, answers in a way, or peace, I mean, because all of his songwriting, I mean, Help, it's a very catchy pop song, but if you were to just put the
Yeah,
lyrics on paper, it's pretty intense, It's like a
yeah,
literal plea for help. Nowhere Man, you could see a lot of sort of self-deprecation, a lot of doubt in the stuff. I mean, obviously it's what drove John, so that was part of his genius and his greatness. But you could see, I mean, he was always searching for something, and I think he was searching for success, found that wasn't the answer. They go to India in search of, well, first it was, obviously through drugs and LSD, so he's trying to find an answer there because in the '60s, the drug thing was a little bit different than now, whereas it was more of a pathway to people thought was going to be enlightenment and opening up your mind and stuff before it became just purely recreational. Um, and then, going in India was another surge. And you could just see he constantly was like disillusionment with every stage of it, was in an unhappy marriage with Cynthia, just, it was, she was almost like too normal, like almost too much the ideal wife in some ways for
yeah,
him, too domesticated, which was not him. It's not kind of what his spirit was calling for. He needed someone artistic, and kind of eventually what he found in Yoko. But always kind of on that search, and you see as he goes to Lost Weekend and all of that. I mean, he's just always
mm,
constantly searching. And I guess the sad irony of his life was, it seemed like he finally found some semblance of peace, like shortly, like right before he died. He took that break from recording, was a house husband for a while, and it seemed like there, and having Sean and all that, and just settling into just being himself, not having
yeah,
a record contract and anyone to answer to. It seemed like when he chose to come back, it was of his own accord, and he was at peace. The songs that came out on Double Fantasy, you could tell it's a sound of a contented person,
yeah.
Um, but yeah, definitely during the Beatles years, he was always on that quest for something.
And I think that dissonance or that or like striving, never arriving, that term, like
Yeah,
maybe that just rubs me the wrong way. Like, and and that's not to say that I don't see the genius in it. I think I just don't enjoy it in music. Like, that's not fair to say. I don't enjoy it in his music. Like I think that it is pertinent in so much, like Leonard Cohen I love,
right.
right? Like there's so many artists that I can go through the list of where like Bob Dylan. I mean like the Who. I mean the Who. They're like Tommy is all about that. Tommy is all about like this search. But there's two things. There was there's this picture. My one of my friends in high school used to have it. And he used to be obsessed with Lennon, or probably still is. But there's this picture where it's like the four, and they're at a party, and like Paul, Ringo, and George are just staring at John like, like they're just like, and John is doing this like exaggerated like like he's like reaching out, and and he looks like he's on, and this is around Sergeant Pepper around that time period, like he's got the like the goatee or whatever,
Mhm.
and they're just kind of like, oh, okay, buddy, are we gonna do this again tonight? Like, you want to get some attention? Like, okay. We love you. Like you can tell that they love him. But he's there. He's that like he's the star brother that they're like, oh, okay, and John's on. All right, great. And I think I respect the hell out of him for doing that, and I fear that side of me. So
Yeah.
I think it's personal that I'm also like that's like it's
Yeah,
not for me.
he's mirroring a little too much of what you're trying to kind of keep tone down in yourself, right?
Right. And again, it's I'm talking about a party. I wish I was if I was that big of a musical genius, like whoa.
Yeah.
Um, and the other thing too that I think kind of rubbed me the wrong way. I hope I don't get shot for saying all this stuff. Um, I'm not manifesting it. I think we'll be fine. But in the Imagine documentary, like or the original one, like the
Yeah.
Imagine video, where there's that homeless guy
Yeah.
that knocks on his door and stuff, and like I don't know that whole conversation that he has with him it felt so like I always felt like John is trying to be esoteric. Like John is trying to be more of an intellectual than he might be.
Mhm.
And nothing that he said made sense to me. Like it didn't resonate with me. Like it just didn't land. Then he goes, you know what, are you hungry? And then that to me was actually very honest. Where he's just like you see this like kind like British soul. Not like
Yeah.
he's just like, all right, come on, my friend. Like we're all like you could see the working class hero. Like
Yeah.
you being like, listen, we're all down and out. I'll get you some food. Like
Yeah.
that to me seemed to be real.
Yeah, you could tell in that conversation he kind of gave up trying to like explain the kind of loftier, kind of idea of what he was trying to get across about like,
Right.
it's it doesn't mean anything, the lyrics and all that kind of stuff. And you could tell like the fan is just kind of like disillusioned, with that piece of it. But yeah, he had the kindness to then just say, screw all that. Just, I mean, you know, name anyone nowadays and start welcome like someone like that knocking on your door into your home, and it goes to show you it speaks to the times a
Right.
lot.
Very different. Now it's terrifying. Like to think about it.
Yeah, you'd have someone like that shot before they even got through your gate, so it's
Which to be fair, that should have been the case with George Harrison. Right? He had someone break into his house with a knife and like cut him up.
yeah, yeah,
That's terrifying. Like
yeah, yeah, for sure. Can you imagine that? Another crazed fan kind of trying to
yeah.
kill you for their own notoriety. That's when you got a little too much fame.
Right.
That
Right.
Beatle level fame, did have that dark undercurrent the whole way. I mean, you see that through their entire story. Whether it's what happened in the Philippines or like the Bible Belt, and obviously later on, with business issues and crazy fans, and just a kind of the dark side of that for sure.
Wait, what happened in the Philippines? I don't know that story.
Remember they snubbed Marcos. They were playing a show there, and they had like one day off. I mean, it was rare for them to have any time off during that time.
Yeah.
Their work ethic was ridiculous as far as how much they got done in that time frame. But she invited them to the palace, for a big, kind of meet and greet, politician. And they just said they weren't going. And it's like that made front page news, like Beatles snub, Melvin Marcos and all that stuff. So yeah, it turned into a big deal where they had to kind of basically sneak them out of the country because, the repercussions were so intense. And that was in the middle of that whole, I think it was the 66 tour where it was just, they were really getting burned out on the touring thing. That was just
Yeah.
like the last straw that year of touring. And that was kind of one of those things that is like, okay, in addition to just not being able to hear themselves and,
Right.
getting a little bit shoddy with the live playing and all that. So
Have you seen like a full? Is there a full recording of that last performance? It was in Chicago, wasn't it? It was like Comiskey.
uh, Candlestick Park.
Oh, Candlestick Park.
Candlestick Park was where that last performance was. And I don't know if they have like a full, I've never seen like a full show of that. The only full show of like that period that they have somewhere is obviously Shea Stadium, which they haven't
Yeah.
released like officially full, but they did make a film of it back then. And that's kind of what exists now. So you get a sense of what that kind of the stadium level
Yeah.
gig, which was, the first of its kind, what that hysteria looked like. Cause you have people trying to jump barriers and, run the
Yeah.
field and all that. So
Wow, that's
scary
crazy.
shit.
So the more we're talking about it, though, I do see. I mean, I do see the value, and I'm like, there are a lot of songs that. I mean, I guess the truth of it is, there are probably more John songs that I like than Paul songs. Like when I really get down to them, I just think of them as Paul songs.
Yeah, I mean, I always thought like it's an interesting journey that they go on, right? Because I felt like obviously John was a clear leader in the
Yeah.
beginning. You have Paul second in command, but obviously kind of Paul eyeing the number one spot, because he knows he's worthy of it and stuff. Um, and like the early albums are, I feel like they're dominated by John's voice.
Yeah.
Uh, his songs. I think they're, in those first few albums, I think they're the stronger of the two. Then you kind of have Paul slowly emerging into kind of like the middle albums. I think in the Hard Day's Night album, the balance started getting more even, and then from then
Yeah.
on, you had
Like Rubber
Paul
Soul
really more.
Revolver.
Yeah,
That's where I really started seeing the split, you know?
yeah, yeah. Yeah,
Yellow
because
Submarine.
yeah, up until that point, you had that kind of real intense group mentality, and as they're getting older, obviously they're getting more going more inward, writing more personal songs, bringing more of their experience to bear.
Yeah.
So you see more of their voices. But the fair assumption is whoever sang lead on it was the at least the dominant writer of the song. So
Did they also helped each other orchestrally, right? Like with the orchestrations?
yeah, and obviously that's also where George Martin had a big
Yeah.
hand in that because I think John would probably be able to kind of hum the ideas, Paul too. But I feel like the orchestration stuff, I feel like that's a Paul touch that he'd want to go that way, whereas John
Yeah.
is more of a rocker, you know, which is I think after Pepper, you kind of hear John kind of accusing that of being more like a Paul album because it's Paul's idea and stuff, whereas he felt it was a bit overproduced. So you get to the White Album, which I think is John's shining moment, where it's just songs that John wants to write, not as heavily produced, really just writing about himself, his obsessions. I don't think he has a like weak track on that album, really. I think that's kind of like his crowning achievement. I think his songs on the White Album.
Yeah. Yeah,
And Paul's songs are great too, but I mean, I think John's really stole the show for that album. I think
oh yeah.
Paul's moment was later on Abbey Road, where I think that was his crowning achievement as far as the Beatles goes.
Were they see I know I'm thinking about like White Album definitely the more time it feels like there's a rift happening. Like is that when their relationship started going south?
Yeah, actually, it was really with I think the Magical Mystery Tour project was where the cracks started to appear because what if you remember Brian Epstein had died I think shortly before that, right?
Yeah.
Like a little bit after the Sergeant Pepper period. And so obviously I think Brian was the closest thing to a semi type, maybe George Martin too, but like as a constant like father figure type to keep them in line and
Yeah.
this is the agenda, this is kind of what we're doing, this is how we're releasing stuff, this is how we're doing things, the kind of the grand orchestrator of everything. And then he's gone, so you can see like even in the footage when the news people approaching the Beatles coming back from India with with that news, you could tell like John's like shell shocked. I mean of all of them, you would think John, because I think John kind of gave Brian like the hardest time and stuff like that, but I think they were the closest. And yeah, he looks shell shocked. And so Paul, I think just to keep them afloat and like that natural kind of survivor instinct that he has, it's like, oh man, I gotta like kind of take charge, and that would be something that obviously would wear on the others as they get further and further in, because he was always trying to keep them working, keep them busy, whereas the others, even Ringo would say they'd be like in their gardens and dread the phone call coming in from Paul, like, oh, time to get back to work, lads, But yeah, so go ahead.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that like I know Brian Epstein dying was like huge for them, but like I didn't know that Paul became a taskmaster after that. That's interesting.
Yeah, a bit much, and so like it's his, Pepper was his idea, but I think they were all on board with that, because it was a break away from sort of the straitjacket of the Beatles image, kind of buy them a whole separate identity and a whole separate freedom. But then with Magical Mystery Tour, I think I don't think they were all like that enthusiastic about it, but they jumped in, and contributed and stuff. But then you get to the White Album, and that's where like in the studio, they're spending much more time in the studio, and that's where it starts getting rife. Yoko enters the picture, and so you have John's attention going there, so that's creating stress. She's in the studio all the time, so that's creating that division from that group identity. And obviously later when you get to the Let It Be project, I mean, I think they were really getting sick of Paul's, hey, come on, let's let's do it, lads, kind of thing. They kind of capped off on it. I think they just wanted to be anywhere else but there.
That is, I did not know that. So Paul's really the one in charge of destroying the Beatles.
Yeah, well, his argument would be like if he didn't, if he didn't push them, we probably wouldn't have those later albums, you know. So, you know, in a way, you know, you needed someone like that who was the type A personality. Um, and you know, at the same time, you have John going full circle because he was the leader in the beginning, kind of psychically abdicated that a little bit to
Mm.
Paul around the Pepper Magical Mystery Tour era. Meets Yoko and he starts kind of feeling confident again, you know, and
Yeah.
feeling strong again, and comes back with, you know, starts becoming dominant, you know, during the White Album as well. So of course that's going to create that clash too, because you know
Right.
it's at that point you have both of these guys vying for like that,
Two alphas.
yeah, two alphas for sure.
And then talk to me about Yellow Submarine.
Yellow Submarine, it's a funny project, right? Because that's one that these guys really didn't want to have anything to do with, and after
Uh,
the fact, they kind of regretted it because it turned out to be, you know, successful, right? But it all sprang out of, remember the television cartoon series, right?
yeah.
So I guess the people, the creative behind that, which I think were also the creative people behind the Flintstones and those cartoons, wanted to do a full length feature, and these guys couldn't be asked to do anything at that point as far as anything to do with it, you know.
Right.
They, you know, didn't want to do the voices, you know, barely contributing, like, you know, scraps for the soundtrack. You could tell it's all like C tier material that they're just
Yeah.
doing to kind of, you know, get out of you know, contract, accelerate some of the contracts and stuff. But then, you know, the whole thing turned out to be great and well received, and like in retrospect they kind of thought, oh, maybe we should have done our voices, you know, because they end up just doing that short cameo at the end, you know, that live action cameo where, you know,
Yeah.
for the last few minutes. Um, so yeah, that was largely out of their hands, even though John, I think, contributed a few ideas in terms of some of the animation stuff, but I think they largely left it to them, to
But
the
that's a
creative.
but that's like a whole album too, though, right? Like,
Well, it is. I think with that, it was like, I guess the way they released some of the soundtrack albums, it was like, I think once either half of it or one side of it was like songs, you know, and the other half was like Martin's orchestrations
right.
and that kind of filler material. So
But they didn't consider that one of their, like, in their catalog of albums.
no, in fact, I have another buddy of mine who's kind of getting into the Beatles, discovering the Beatles, and you know, as he's going through the albums, he's loving the albums and stuff. But he goes like, "What the hell's up with this Yellow Submarine?" I said, "This is not technically like a real studio album of theirs. You know, it's a soundtrack. It's kind of filler material. It's kind of like the American version of Help. You know, the British version is, you always want to go to the UK versions for the right albums. The American version of Help, I think it was the same thing where it had half Beatles songs and half like George Martin's
Mm.
orchestrations and stuff.
And half of Richard Lester's slapstick bullshit.
Yeah.
Uh, if you're a Superman fan, not a lot of people are big fans of Richard Lester, who directed the Beatles movies and then Superman 3 and or Superman 2 and 3. Half of Superman, not even half, like a third of Superman 2. But regardless, so it's interesting to hear too that, like, you know, these were such legends, but like they were real people. I mean, I know it's simple, but things didn't work out it wasn't like as famous as they were, it wasn't like everything they touched turned to gold.
Yeah. I mean, commercially, pretty much it was that way, you know, like everything met with success. I think the only thing that was kind of poorly received initially was the Magical Mystery Tour movie.
Yeah.
You know,
Ugh.
they released it on Boxing Day in England, and you know, it's like supposed to be like a high profile spot to watch it.
Yeah.
Initially screened it in black and white, and you know, it's like this LSD Merry Pranksters kind of thing. Like
Yeah.
the mainstream audience is not going to take to that pretty well. But other than that, like pretty much everything else that they released, at least commercially, did well. You know, the other films did well too. But you know, it's the humanity starts coming in around the White Album and Let It Be. You know, the Let It Be movie is
Yeah.
a clear illustration of really getting to peek behind the curtain and see these guys as real human beings, and
Yeah.
you know, like family, right? And like real family, it's messy, and you know, it's, you know, they were real brothers in a way, and you know, the downside of that is that, you know, they were real brothers with
Right.
all the tensions and the, you know, the psychological underpinnings that come with that.
Do you know? That's why I have to say my favorite Beatle, like for real, like so between John and Paul, it's Paul, but like well, I don't know anymore though. Now we're talking about this, I'm like, oh, Paul doesn't sound like my favorite anyway. I was like, it's always been George. Like I love George's voice, I love his writing style. Like, I to me, George has always been my favorite.
Yeah, and I think thankfully now too, George is I think getting his just desserts. You know, for a long
Yeah,
time he was kind of like third string kind of thing, but I think since his passing, there has been that deeper investigation and revision.
yeah,
It's I think the most streamed song of theirs is like "Here Comes the Sun,"
right.
and something is like right up there too. So it's he was huge. I mean, if where I really, I mean, I was always a fan of George's songs,
Yeah,
but where you really see it is when they did the concert for George, and you see people just playing just his tracks, and it's like these are phenomenal songs.
yeah,
They have their own character within the Beatles albums, and it's like the little kid brother who then, by the time of the White Album, like While My Guitar Gently Weeps. I mean, that's
right.
killer. I mean, one of their all-time best songs, period. And he brought other elements to them. The kind of I felt like you had the two big egos with John and Paul, and he was like the one kind of putting the pin in the balloon a little bit of like fame and getting more into the spiritual side of things, introducing those elements, always introducing those esoteric pieces, whether
Right.
it was the sitar or just the Indian instrumentation. So I thought he was a huge influence that, we see it more now, but back then I don't think he got as much credit. And Ringo, to me, I still rank him as one of the all-time great drummers, I think with people, the debate they have with this is if by drummer, if you're looking for like a flashy
Right. Keith
guy,
Moon.
that's not
Yeah.
Ringo. Ringo's a song drummer, but I think among musicians and drummers who really understand like how to make drums work within a song and a production,
Yeah.
I think Ringo's highly rated for sure. He was definitely the right drummer for the Beatles. You couldn't have had
No.
Keith Moon in the Beatles. Keith Moon
Right.
was great for the Who, never would have worked in the Beatles. Someone
But you
drawing
know,
attention to themselves.
well, he was great for the Who in their first incarnation, but
Yeah,
like moving, I mean, it's unfortunate. Very unfortunate that he died. And again, like you had all these guys that were at the top of their game. I mean, John Entwistle, like Jesus, like
yeah,
so flashy and like blah, 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 blah. Like what I mean, just such an amazing bassist. Obviously Pete Townsend, and then Roger Daltrey post Tommy, like he comes in. But like I think but John Entwistle still, I feel like he was not a front man. Like he was still like he could stay with the group longer, and
yeah.
he was more sustainable. Keith Moon, I don't think he would have sustained the 70s or 80s or like late 70s and 80s.
Right.
He died in
Yeah,
the
I
late 70s.
agree. I mean, he was already on a big self-destructive streak.
Right,
That guy was meant to burn bright for for a
right.
short time, and burn out.
But that's
Unfortunately.
where Ringo just knew his place. Like Ringo was there to support and anchor, right? Like
Yeah, Ringo was never about like the flashy drum solos. He just, was into the song, but he always, it was funny because I saw a video recently where it was just it was someone just demonstrating Ringo's stuff on
yeah,
drums. And you just play those parts, and a testament to Ringo is the damn song.
right.
Because playing the fills for different songs, and you just know you're singing along to the tracks.
Uh-huh.
But he brought a musicality to the drums, if that makes any sense.
Of
Because
course, like a
he's the
melody
great,
almost.
yeah. It was like the placement of it, the touch, and plus, whether it was how they recorded him or obviously how he kind of muffled things or whatever, but his drum sound was impeccable too. I mean, you
Yeah,
still get people, Oasis would go to borrow that drum sound, and even kind of current like indie bands, it's still about that Ringo sound. So
yeah.
that's
I
giving them their due.
I was watching this like 3 hour long like Tom Petty documentary that Peter Bogdanovich directed. Um,
Yeah,
really good movie, and like just Ringo pops in and out, and like and I've seen him in so many other rock documentaries where these guys like these legends later in life, like 80s, 90s, 2000s, Ringo comes in and he's just flawless. Like I think he's so underrated,
well, his timing too. Like that's the thing is you get other drummers that may be flashier, but they don't know how to keep time. And Ringo,
right?
like Paul would always say, Ringo's time was impeccable. And that's the thing, that you need someone in a band like the Beatles. You need someone who obviously going to serve the song, because when you have such great songwriters, you're not going to play all over those songs, right? And someone to keep great time,
Yeah.
So, I know, I mean, John would always refer to him too. I mean, both John and Paul, you always say that he was their favorite drummer of all time. So,
Yeah.
and John would, I mean, go on to utilize Ringo too in his early solo work. So,
Well, there you have it. I came into this thinking one thing, and now I'm like, yeah, no, you're right. Like it's just it's a hard call because like they're all so talented, and I'm a big Who fan. Like I personally I love the Beatles, but like I'm a Who fan,
yeah,
in my core, on my inside. But now I'm like, man, though, like I respect the Beatles so much. Like the Beatles, just like you're right. Like in their early incarnation, especially when they were all team, like it's hard to separate them. Like they were so congealed, like so
yeah.
cohesive. It's just that's like the epitome of a flawless band.
Yeah, I mean,
But
untouchable. They just they were so dialed into each other, and that's where that intensity of like living that fishbowl existence that they did, it would destroy them later. But that's also the only way you get that kind of synergy as a band, where you're just basically, it's like what Mick Jagger once referred to them as, like the four-headed monster,
yeah,
because they were one. They were kind of very unified, and you could tell that there was a group um, mission right up through where it peaked with Pepper. You could tell that they were, you weren't seeing that division or that kind of bickering. They were very unified, had a very unified front, very unified vision for what they wanted the band to be. I think it reached its peak with Pepper, obviously with the amount of time that went into that album and the amount of work. And then, after that, you start seeing them becoming individuals, and you had
yeah,
John with his particular genius, would always continue to write those very confessional, heartfelt songs, that really, he just had that touch, for being someone kind of in such a lofty plane. He still had that touch with the people,
yeah.
and with Paul, you just had that someone who just is so innately musical that even his knockoffs sound great for some
Right.
reason. There are demos out there of like him, singing to like his dog Eddie, and if you just listen to that track, it's such a throwaway track, but it has his voice, it has his little guitar playing, and in the hands of anyone else, it would be, it would be a hit, as silly as that song is. And I think maybe that was been his undoing sometimes, is that it's come so easy to him that he doesn't go and put in that second and third polish on the draft,
Yeah.
but again, kind of perfect voice, you know, we get into his bass playing in another time, I mean,
I was gonna say that. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, one of the greatest bass players ever, which I think comes down to just, again, his musicality, his sense of melody seeped into an instrument that normally in the past had just been like a rhythmic instrument, kind of keeping time with the drummer. And he really started ushering it in as something that was offering counterpoint in a song, and so.
In contrast, did he consider himself a bassist though? Like, because it's so funny. I don't. I know he was an amazing bassist, and I know like Elvis was intimidated by him because of the bass, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think when they met, Elvis was learning bass. So I think Paul kind of
Yeah.
used that as his chance to buddy up to him and say, hey, I'm going to show you some stuff on bass and stuff.
Yeah.
I think he grew into it by Pepper, because he started as a guitar player,
Right.
but obviously no one was going to tell John not to be a guitar player, and John was a great rhythm player, so you're going to have John as your rhythm player. George was much more polished as a lead player, so Paul kind of ended up with it as by default once we lost Stuart Sutcliffe, who was the original bass player. But I think by the time he got into like 66, 67, that's where he really said, yeah, I'm the bass player in this band, because he's spending much more time in the studio just working with Jeff Emmerich, just working on bass parts, like well into like, the midnight hours and stuff, and just working on creating those parts. So I think by then he was kind of like, yeah, I'm the bass guy.
He's all in.
Yeah.
Bruce, this was so informative. Like, this is super cool, man.
Yeah, I almost feel like we could do a part 2 of this,
I know, right? Is there anything else you want to add about Paul, John, Ringo, or George?
I guess that, my final bit is just that, here we're obviously breaking up the constituent parts,
Right.
but the reality is, like, I think anyone who's been in a band or knows music is that, you can't really isolate those parts. You can kind of analyze it and break it down, but what made them great was the four
Yeah.
different parts. It's like Paul has said that it's like a square. You take any of the sides off, and I agree with that. Because you couldn't have a band of four Johns and four Pauls. It would have defeated the purpose of like what that perfect chemistry and balance was. You needed John for certain parts and certain character traits of the band. You definitely needed Paul to balance out John. You needed George as sort of that third voice in there, between that sort of tug of war of power between John and Paul. And you needed that perfect drummer in Ringo to kind of make it all work. And let's not forget that Ringo in the early days was actually, to some people, like just like your general kind of middle America audience, was the star, because he's the star of their first two films. If you think about it, he's a better actor than any of them in those movies. And because he stood out, was different, was called Ringo, had the rings, a lot of people, he was kind of like the one that a lot of people knew as like in general.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think people forget that, but it's like, Ringo was huge.
He's the one. Yeah, you're right. Like he was so like I'm thinking back to the interviews, the early interviews, and he's the one doing the Elvis impression, right? Like he's the goofy one. You're right. He was the star, and then by Yellow Submarine, Magical Mystery Tour, that era, he's pushed aside in the back, kind of.
Yeah. But again, those early years, it's like you had the kind of the other three who were kind of similar in look and height and stuff, and you had Ringo, who was kind of like the everyman. So it's kind of like everyone else's entry into the band in a way. You can relate to Ringo.
It's so funny you're saying the early days, and you're talking about a stretch of 10 years.
Well, that's the other thing that is like that's why they'll never be matched, right? Because you have bands these days that take like 10 years between albums, right? These guys fit everything. Their whole recorded output is like 7-8 years, which is insane to think about that, and the growth between those albums. Unbelievable. I mean, their whole career is done, by the end of the 60s.
Right, but when you're looking at the Stones or Tom Petty or any Bob Dylan, like these guys. I mean, I saw Bob Dylan in the early 2000s or late 90s, early 2000s, and he still rocks the same way and again, it was the same energy as early, like 80s, 70s, like. So I think you have these legends that have been around for decades upon decades. The Beatles were around for like a second compared to these other guys.
Yeah, and so that it's also, it speaks a lot that you're comparing other bands that have been longer, other careers, to this band. That again, people don't remember that, but it's like it's a very, very short window. They just did so much because they worked so hard. Back then in the 60s, you're doing 2 albums a year, multiple singles. Maybe you're doing a movie, you're doing television appearances. I mean, these guys didn't stop in terms of the output. So crazy.
Bruce, this was super enlightening and super helpful, my man. I like talking with you about this stuff.
Yeah, it was fun. All
right, tune in for another episode. Next week, we're going to discuss Flash Gordon. I'm just kidding. We don't know what we're going to discuss yet, but thank you. Definitely stick around. And
we'll come up with something good.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, take care.